Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we explore the great Platonic dialogue, the Pheado. The Pheado is one of the most famous of all the Platonic dialogues. The dialogue concerns itself with the nature of the human soul and the afterlife. At least, that's what it seems to be about. The dialogue also contains the famous Affinity Argument and Simmias's response, in which the soul and body are linked together in a harmony like a lyre. We will explore the four basic arguments of the Pheado, along with why, from this dialogue in particular, there is a controversy as to whether Plato's philosophy implies world flight, as many have claimed or charged, over the millennia, and, in actuality, the dialogue's implications toward political philosophy. One of the undercurrent metaphysical debates in the Pheado is between physicalism and idealism. Physicalism is the philosophy that maintains that the first principles of existence are entirely material, or physical, hence the term. Idealism, by contrast, asserts that the first principles of existence are ideas, or consciousness, or the soul, since the soul is the seat of our ideas as part of our minds. The larger claim here is that our minds are not really meat blobs, but idea warehouses, so to speak, in which all of our ideas and recollection emanate from. There are many other metaphysical positions to take between these two, and they have been presented throughout the history of philosophy, but these two, physicalism and idealism, are embedded in between the lines throughout the Pheado. Socrates asserts the immortality of the soul, but is also questioning what transpires to the body and the soul upon death. For Socrates, as it is with traditional Platonism, body and soul seem to be separate. The body is an imperfect reflection of the ideal, which the soul has ingrained in it. But for Socrates, we can ask the question, is the body an obstacle to knowledge? Ultimately, Socrates concludes that to be freed from the body is a form of purification. He who lives for wisdom and knowledge looks forward to death. It is this issue that has historically led many to assert that Platonism always has the tendency to veer toward world flight, although Plato himself seems pretty at home with the material world and other aspects of his philosophy. After all, the practical implications of Plato's philosophy relates to the world we live in. It is wrong to see Plato as advocating any type of world flight, even with regard to the soul. The soul is embodied in this world, and knowledge is tied to the embodied life in this world. While body and soul may be separate, and those who understand and know wisdom are okay with death, nevertheless, we never shun this world. It is important to remember that in classical philosophy, the soul is considered the rational part of the mind. This is also the purview of the understanding of the soul in Orthodox and historic Christianity. The question of the first principles of reality, contrasted with the monistic materialists or physicalists, arguing that everything was matter, including consciousness or the soul, the monistic idealists, who argued that reality was really consciousness, or to be found in the apprehensions and the understanding of the soul, and the pluralists, more associated with historic Christianity, arguing a combination of both, we must understand Plato as arguing for the monistic idealist position. Plato's view, of course, is somewhat nuanced, But the ultimate reality, as we know, is the realm of the forms, which only the mind and not the body has access to. Hence again the tendency, unfortunately, to see Plato as advocating world flight. However, once again, Plato does not deny the reality or the importance of the physical or the body. The body contains in it the soul, and the soul has access to the realm of the forms. This understanding impacts our lives in the body in this world. The first argument concerning the immortality of the soul is the cyclical argument. It is the argument of cyclicality. It draws from Heraclitus's principle of the unity of opposites. Thus, living and dying, those who have life and those who are dead, go together, much like sleep is tied to awake and hot is tied to cold. They coexist with each other, and our understanding of living and dead, sleep and awake, hot and cold, are necessarily combined with the other. We would not know hot if we did not know cold. Death, therefore, is tied to life, and life tied to death. We would not really know what life is without death, and without death, therefore, we would not know what life is. In life, one is moving to death. It is a straightforward and logically interconnected argument common to the ancient belief in the cyclical notions of time and reincarnation. But this assertion has an obvious problem. If the soul is immortal, and death linked to life, and life linked to death, the only logical position to take from cyclicality is a form of reincarnation, which is something Plato possibly believed in from other dialogues. Why? If one dies, whereby the soul keeps on living in this unity of opposites through cyclicality, the soul cannot live eternally in heaven, since this would break the cycle and unity of opposites, life and death. So the only possible option is that the soul migrates in death to a new form of life. This idea of the migration of the soul is called metempsychosis in Greek philosophy. Plato tentatively lays out this view right here in the Pheado, but also in the Republic and the Timaeus. Since the unity of opposites and the cyclical nature of opposites cannot be broken, the soul is immortal as it migrates in death to life. Because souls experience the world, this is why, according to Plato, humans have the ability to recollect things without needing necessarily to be taught. This moves us to the second argument of the soul's immortality in the Pheado. The argument is the argument of recollection. It is again important to remember that classical philosophy generally rejects the idea of the tabula rasa, or the blank slate. The early signs of the proto-tabula rasa can be found in Aristotle. The argument of recollection is simple. To recall knowledge comes from having learned it in a prior life. And again, this follows from the argument of cyclicality. The soul would have learned things in a prior life. Upon death, it migrates, the metempsychosis, to a new body, and in that new body, that new life, recollects or gains its knowledge. Hence, the soul is immortal and gain knowledge of things in the past, which are now recalled in the present. This is the awakening of the soul, or the awakening of the mind. But this leads to another problem. Was the mind ever a blank slate to begin with? For example, the first person with the first soul. Does the soul learn, then migrate to another after death? If so, that means the first person had a blank slate. Of course, this is not the topic of conversation in the dialogue. It is the immortality of the soul. But this argument of recollection ought to provoke other questions from the reader or the listener. This is one of them. Was there ever a point in time in life where the soul did not have knowledge? The third argument in the Pheado about the immortality of the soul is the Affinity Argument. And this is one of the most famous arguments concerning the immortality of the soul. The Affinity Argument is an idea that more closely remains tied to Plato's doctrine of the forms. The soul is immortal, invisible, and akin to something divine. This is the divinization of reason. Human reason is the divine spark of existence, which gives humans the ability to understand, much like God understands everything. This again is a common view in ancient philosophy. Reason is God, and God is reason. Logos philosophy and logos theology for those more attuned to the finer details of Greek, Latin, and even Christian philosophy and theology. Human bodies, though material and mortal, need something to actualize them, to awake them. Reason or consciousness is not the product of materiality in this argument. Thus, the human is a composite of body and soul. The virtuous, or those who lack appreciation for beauty and knowledge, have the soul imprisoned in another body, as the dialogue says. The virtuous souls ascend to the realm of the forms, or heaven, to experience the bliss of pure beauty and knowledge on account of their virtue. This, of course, moves us into a dualistic metaphysics. The soul is immortal and material, while the body is material and decomposes over the course of time. Thus, there are two kinds of existence, the immaterial and the material, with transcendent reason, the soul belonging to the former, and the human body with its desires to the latter. Simmias, one of the dialogue partners, interjects with a famous rebuttal. The analogy of the harmony of the lyre is not a denial of the soul, but rather a denial of the immortality of the soul. Each soul is unique to each body. The soul dies with the body. According to Simmias, the soul and body is the lyre, and strings and all other physical parts of the lyre. When in harmony, this, in totality, is the soul. It allows the lyre to do what the lyre is made to do. In this manner, the human, who is made for coming to understand himself and the world, needs the soul, the rational mind, in order to make him fully human. The anthropology laid out by Simmias, or at least implied in the argument, is rather Platonic, insofar that both Simmias and Plato agree that the telos of humanity is the satisfaction of being in harmony with the self. The body enjoying what it has come to know, e.g. leaving the cave to experience and understand the sunlight, the true knowledge of the world. However, the difference is the soul is immortal for Plato, while it is mortal for Simmias. In time, the lyre eventually decomposes and is no longer in harmony, and therefore becomes useless and dies. This happens to humans too. Ergo, the soul eventually dies with the body. The final argument for the soul's immortality is the form of life argument. This again is a close companion to Plato's doctrine of the forms, and explicitly contradicts the cyclical argument that we heard at the beginning of the dialogue. Most scholars believe this contradiction is intentional on Plato's part. The four arguments are meant to get the mind, the soul, thinking. For the thinking mind is also the living mind. It is also generally accepted that the form of life argument is the argument for the soul's immortality that Plato most personally identified with and likely adhered to in his life. You will also note, as you read through the dialogue, how these four arguments correlate with one another. The argument of cyclicality closely relates to and may even imply the argument of recollection. The affinity argument stands as the dialectical contrast to the form of life argument. And, mind you, the affinity argument contradicts the entire argument of cyclicality and recollection, which the form of life argument also does. The argument is simple because it follows directly with Platonic idealism. Since reality, and therefore life, is the product of the human mind, the soul is the cause of life. Life is fulfilled by beauty, beauty is a form, and the soul is what permits us to know beauty since it came from the reality of the forms. This is why, for instance, one need not necessarily be a philosopher per se to have an experience and appreciation of beauty. One simply sees beauty and knows that this is something beautiful. One does not need extensive philosophical training to have an experience of awe, wonder, and beauty. Such a person may not be able to properly explain beauty, like the philosopher, but anyone, regardless of their education, has this innate knowledge of the experience of beauty, because the beautiful is rooted in its origination in the realm of forms, which all souls have access to. Each form correlates with its respective form, just as beauty always relates to the form of beauty in its realm. Thus, we move away from the unity of opposites, which served as the foundation of the cyclical argument, thereby contradicting it. Again, this contradiction is intentional, most scholars believe, because it is a literary device used by Plato to show maturation and dialectic at work. The earliest argument is moved away from because it has become untenable. A new argument is advanced. This argument, in this case the form of life argument, seems much more solid than the others and is settled upon. Of course, you also have the progression of the text moving in the direction to Plato's famous doctrine of the forms. We didn't really see the forms in the argument of cyclicality. It may have been implied in the argument of recollection, but now it is clearly come to fruition in this form of life argument. Hence, through the earlier argument, though in principle they agree, mostly at least, concerning the immortality of the soul, Plato is also critiquing arguments from within his own text, even if they agree on principle. The aim is always truth, not agreement on principles. It doesn't matter if you agree on principles if the principles you agree upon do not correlate with the truth. We agree to disagree is an irrational argument, though we moderns like to repeat this supposedly modern wisdom. The point of dialectic is to arrive at truth. To say we agree to disagree is a failure to arrive at truth. The soul, then, comes from the realm of forms. The soul understands all the forms, beauty most importantly, and since the soul is the beginning of life, the soul brings awareness, consciousness, to the human body. The human body, or person, now with their soul, is able to experience and understand the world he is in. Since the unity of opposites is excluded, soul as beginning of life means the soul is life. Life cannot be overcome by death, since the unity of opposites is now rejected. The body dies because the body is not the source of life. The soul is. Therefore, the soul is immortal. It's a fairly logical and easy argument to follow. The death of the body leads to the freedom of the soul, and the soul returns to the realm of the forms before bringing life to another body, e.g. in birth. Though this dialogue doesn't seem to have much to do with politics, in reality it does. As mentioned in our earlier lectures on the great books of Plato, Plato was the great political philosopher and ethicist. He was concerned with what kind of city, polis, do we live in. He was intensely political in the classical sense of the word, i.e., not the ideological sense of politics, which is actually a form of anti-politics. Political, in the Greek philosophic tradition, was to belong to a community, a politia, a polis. To be political was to be an active member of that polis and to know one's place in the polis. To be political had nothing to do with changing the social and juridical fabric of one's city, nor was it to be the scoffed-at man of action Aristotle derides in his Politics. In the backdrop of the sophist era, who wield logi, speech, for power, Plato was confronting this power-centered materialist worldview with nature, truth, and absolute knowledge. Plato felt that, ironically, those who denied nature, truth, and knowing put the political reality in a dangerous situation. For all the power of Athens in the age of the Sophists, they had lost the Peloponnesian War and had slipped into tyranny. They had seen their democracy, so eloquently eulogized by Pericles in his funeral oration in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, fall into despotism. In the aftermath of that tyranny, Plato grew up and sought to understand the failure of Athens to prevent its fall into desolate tyranny. The integrated harmony of Simmias's argument is one of the most wonderful and memorable speeches in all of Plato's dialogues. It is easy to fall for its seduction. However, Simmias, as we noted, claimed the soul was mortal in the end, whereas the form of life argument argued that the soul was immortal. This is why Plato challenges Simmias's account with the final form of life argument, where he proves the soul is immortal. The soul is a code word in the dialogue for the polis, for the political. Simmias is right that the soul, the polis, is an integrated body, just like the lyre, body and soul together. An integrated body, just like the human body and soul. But Simmias is wrong that the soul is mortal. This would have sweeping reverberations to political society if true. Life cannot be overcome by death, as Plato presents through the form of life argument. This too would have sweeping ramifications to political society if true. For Plato, it is necessary that the soul be immortal for the sake of the political. Without the immortal soul, a civilization will grow weak and succumb to death. It will descend back into the world of tyranny, the tyranny of the sophists, which he challenged, of course, in the Republic. But if the soul is immortal, then the polis is also immortal, because again, the soul is an esoteric code word for the political over the course of the dialogue. If the polis is integrated in its proper form, aligned with truth, and becomes one of the forms, so to speak, it will be able to endure all hardships and not decay into nothingness and tyranny. The soul is necessary for man to be man. It is also necessary for the political to be political. And its immortality is the same end of the polis. For the soul to know the forms, and the forms include the cardinal virtues, justice, prudence, temperance, fortitude. Thus the soul, who makes up the integrated body of the polis, divinizes the polis in the movement to justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude, which is what Athens lacked and was the cause of its descent into tyranny. If the polis is just material, it decays and dies. If the polis is immortal because of the soul, it will ascend and endure. Our responsibility as persons, as men, who are political animals by nature, is to understand the forms, principally the cardinal virtues, justice, prudence, temperance, and fortitude, and live by those forms in our own life in political community. If we do that, if we have a proper understanding of our nature, which includes body and soul, we will also lead to a great flourishing and a renewal, a renaissance of our political cities, our political communities. Once you understand that Plato was a political philosopher, first and foremost, and that all of his dialogues, as we've been discussing, have implications to politics, to political philosophy, you can now see how even in this dialogue, the Pheado, which we think is primarily about the arguments of the soul, its immortality or mortality, is actually a grand dialogue over the nature of the political. Plato uses these arguments about the soul as an esoteric analogy and allegory for the political.